The afternoon sun bore down on the lone gas station, its metal roof shimmering under the cloudless sky. George Kendrick, a 93-year-old retired engineer, stood at Pump 5, calmly refueling his old blue pickup truck. His movements were deliberate, practiced, the steady hum of the gas pump the only sound on the quiet highway. But that silence didn't last. The distant rumble of motorcycles broke the stillness, growing louder with each passing second. George didn't flinch, though he caught their reflection in his truck's rearview mirror. A gang of bikers roared into the gas station, their laughter and shouts cutting through the air. At the head of the pack was Razor, a tall, broad-shouldered man with slicked-back hair and a leather jacket covered in patches.
"Look at this old fossil,"
Razor shouted, his voice dripping with mockery.
"Still driving a truck older than me."
The gang erupted in laughter, parking their bikes in a semicircle around George. Razor dismounted, flipping a switchblade open as he sauntered toward the old man. George finished pumping his gas, replaced the nozzle, and turned to face Razor. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, met the biker's sneering gaze.
"You lost, Grandpa?"
Razor said, leaning against the truck. The switchblade twirled in his hand, catching the sunlight.
"I'm just passing through,"
George replied, his tone calm but firm. Razor's grin widened.
"Well, maybe you should have passed through a little faster."
With a quick motion, he slashed the edge of George's front tire. The hiss of escaping air filled the silence. The gang howled with laughter, but George didn't react. Instead, he stepped closer to Razor, his gaze steady.
"You'll regret this,"
he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that silenced the laughter. For a moment, Razor hesitated. There was something unnerving about George's calmness, something that didn't fit the image of a defenseless old man. But Razor shook it off with a smirk.
"Sure thing, Grandpa. See you around."
George climbed into his truck and drove off, the flat tire groaning against the pavement. Razor watched him go, laughing with his gang. But Razor didn't know who he had just provoked. As George returns home, he makes a phone call that sets an unstoppable chain of events into motion. Razor and his gang have no idea what's coming for them. George pulled into the gravel driveway of his small but sturdy home on the outskirts of town. The engine of his old blue pickup coughed as it shut off, leaving an eerie quiet behind. His flat tire sagged under the weight of the truck, but George didn't seem to care. He stepped out, his weathered boots crunching on the gravel, and headed straight for his house. Inside, the house was modest but organized. Every tool, book, and piece of furniture had its place. To anyone else, it looked like the home of an ordinary retiree, but a closer look revealed a different story. The bookshelves weren't filled with novels. They held engineering manuals, advanced physics texts, and binders full of detailed blueprints. George had spent a lifetime solving problems, and today would be no different. He made his way to the garage, flipping on a single overhead light. The glow revealed what most people would never have guessed: a secret workshop. Blueprints were pinned to the walls, tools were meticulously arranged, and several half-built machines were scattered across workbenches. This wasn't the hobby of a bored old man. It was the workspace of a genius. George opened a locked cabinet, revealing a rotary phone covered in dust. He picked it up, his fingers dialing a number that hadn't been used in decades. Each click of the rotary wheel echoed in the quiet garage. The phone clicked as the line connected. A voice answered on the other end, sharp and authoritative.
"Kendrick, is that you?"
"It's me," George said, his voice calm but firm. There was a pause. "We thought you were done. Retired. Out of the game." "I was," George replied, "but I need the team." The voice on the other end grew serious. "What's happened?" "A group of bikers," George said, glancing at the flat tire visible through the garage window. "They've taken over the town, threatening people. They made it personal." The voice softened but remained cautious. "You sure about this, George? Bringing us back together. There's no going halfway." "I'm sure," George said. "We stopped bigger threats than these thugs in the past. I just need your help to remind them who they're dealing with." The line went silent for a moment before the voice replied. "All right, we'll be there. Give us 24 hours." George hung up the phone and stared at the wall of blueprints. His eyes landed on a large, detailed schematic labeled Project Sentinel. It was a design he hadn't touched in decades, a defense system meant for the battlefield, but today it would serve a different purpose. The first call had been made, but George wasn't waiting idly. He set to work in his garage, pulling out tools and materials. Sparks flew as he began welding metal plates together. Tiny drones, unfinished prototypes from years ago, were dusted off and reprogrammed. Wires, circuits, and gears became the focus of his precise hands. Every tool felt natural in his grip, as if no time had passed since his retirement. As he worked, his mind replayed the encounter at the gas station. Razor's cocky grin, the laughter of the gang, the slash of the tire. They thought they had humiliated an old man, but they had no idea who he really was. At the same time, Razor and his gang were celebrating their so-called victory at a local diner. They laughed loudly, recounting how they had scared off some old geezer. "Did you see his face?" Razor said, slamming his fist on the table. "Thought he was gonna faint right there." The gang erupted in laughter. One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy nicknamed Sketch, looked uneasy. "Boss, you sure that guy's harmless? He didn't seem scared, just weirdly calm." Razor snorted. "What's he gonna do? Call his bingo club to come after us?" The gang roared again, but Sketch couldn't shake the image of George's unflinching eyes. Something about the old man didn't sit right with him. By the time the sun set, George had made significant progress. His garage now looked like a miniature factory. Several small drones were lined up on a table, their LED lights blinking as they came to life. A sleek, portable EMP device sat on the workbench, ready to disable any electronics within a certain radius. George stood back to admire his work. He wasn't done yet, but he felt a sense of satisfaction. For years, he had been told to retire, to leave his engineering days behind. But tonight, he felt alive again. Every calculation, every spark, every precise movement reminded him of who he used to be. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. George wiped his hands on a rag and went to answer it. Standing on the porch was a man in his 60s, thin and sharp-eyed, carrying a metal case. "Max," George said, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "You came fast." Max, a former electronics specialist from George's team, stepped inside. "You called. Of course I came. What are we dealing with?" "Trouble," George replied simply. He gestured to the workshop. "But I think we've still got what it takes to fix it." Max whistled as he looked around. "You've been busy. Looks like the old Kendrick's back." George's expression hardened. "Let's hope I didn't wait too long." By morning, more of George's old team arrives, each bringing their unique expertise. Meanwhile, Razor and his gang plot their next move, unaware that George is transforming his quiet town into a battlefield. The sun had barely risen when George stepped out onto his porch, sipping his first coffee of the day. The air was crisp, and the town was unusually quiet, as if it sensed the brewing storm. The gravel crunched under tires as a sleek black SUV pulled into George's driveway. The door opened, and a man in his late 60s stepped out, carrying a hard-shell case. "George," the man said, his voice carrying a familiar warmth. "You've got that look in your eye, like the old days." "Alex," George replied, shaking his hand firmly. "It's been a while." Alex Haynes had been one of the finest mechanical engineers George had ever worked with. If George was the mind behind their team's most advanced designs, Alex was the one who made them work in the real world. "Max is already here," George said, leading Alex toward the garage. "We've got a lot to do." Inside, Max was already tinkering with one of George's drones, muttering to himself as he connected wires and adjusted circuits. He looked up as Alex entered, grinning. "Alex, thought you'd forgotten how to leave your comfy lab." Alex smirked. "Comfy? You should see my workshop. Makes this place look like an antique shop." Max chuckled, but George cut through their banter with a sharp tone. "Enough catching up. We've got a problem to solve." George laid out the situation. Razor's gang wasn't just a bunch of bullies. They'd been using the town as a hub for smuggling stolen electronics and illegal weaponry. If Razor wasn't stopped, the entire town could fall under their control. "And they think I'm an easy target," George said, his voice steady but firm. "They're about to learn otherwise." The three men got to work. George handed Alex a stack of blueprints, and Alex's eyes lit up as he scanned the designs. "You really kept all this?" Alex asked, flipping through the schematics for traps, EMP devices, and drones. "Some of these could have changed the world." "They're about to change this town," George replied. Max worked on upgrading the drones, programming them to patrol the perimeter of George's property. The tiny machines, no larger than a crow, would be the first line of defense, silent, fast, and nearly invisible. Alex focused on building a portable barricade system that could be deployed to block roads and funnel Razor's gang into specific areas. He grinned as he welded metal plates together. "This is going to be fun." George, meanwhile, worked on the EMP device. It was a compact but powerful unit capable of disabling any electronics within a half-mile radius. If Razor's gang relied on their bikes or any high-tech equipment, they'd find themselves powerless. By midday, 2 more cars pulled into George's driveway. The first was a boxy, old Jeep driven by Claire Bennett, a retired logistics expert. Claire had been the backbone of the team during their glory days, ensuring that every operation ran smoothly. "George," Claire said as she stepped out, her tone brisk but affectionate, "you're looking as stubborn as ever." "And you're looking as bossy as ever," George replied with a faint smile. Behind her came Marty Torres, a stocky man with a knack for improvising weapons and tools out of just about anything. Marty didn't waste time on pleasantries. He immediately started unloading crates from his van. "What's in the boxes?" Max asked, peering over. "Surprises," Marty said with a mischievous grin, "for when things get loud." With the team assembled, George outlined his plan. They would defend not only his property, but also key parts of the town. Surveillance drones would keep an eye on Razor's gang, while the traps and barricades would force them into vulnerable positions. "And when they realize they've bitten off more than they can chew?" Claire asked. George's expression darkened. "We make sure they can't try again." Meanwhile, Razor's gang was gathering at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Razor paced in front of his crew, his switchblade flicking open and closed. "That old man's got guts," Razor said, his tone laced with mockery. "But guts don't fix tires. He's probably crying over his truck right now." Sketch, the younger member of the gang, hesitated before speaking. "Boss, I don't know. He seemed off, like he wasn't scared. It was weird." Razor stopped pacing and glared at Sketch. "You're scared of some old guy?" "No," Sketch said quickly, looking away. "Just something about him didn't feel right." Razor laughed, slapping Sketch on the back. "Don't worry. We'll pay him another visit and remind him who's in charge." The gang cheered, their confidence unshaken. But Razor couldn't shake the memory of George's steady gaze, the way he hadn't flinched. Razor didn't believe in coincidences, and something about the old man felt different. Back at George's house, the team was ready. The drones were fully operational, the traps were in place, and the barricades were loaded onto trucks for deployment around town. George stood in front of one of the drones, holding a small card with a simple message. "You've been warned." He attached the card to the drone, which buzzed to life and zipped out of the garage. The team watched as it disappeared into the sky, heading straight for Razor's warehouse. When the drone arrived, it hovered just outside the warehouse, its cameras recording the gang's activities. Razor noticed it first, his face twisting in confusion. "What the?" He stepped forward, trying to swat it away, but the drone was too quick. It dropped the card at Razor's feet before zipping away. Razor picked up the card, reading the message. His jaw tightened. "He wants to play games? Fine. Let's play." As Razor prepares to strike, George and his team fortify key locations in the town, turning it into a high-tech battlefield. The first skirmish will test their defenses, and Razor will learn just how dangerous George can be. The sun was high as George's team got to work on fortifying the town. This wasn't just about defending George's property anymore. Razor's gang had been terrorizing the entire community, and George wasn't about to let it continue. The team split into smaller groups, each tasked with securing key locations. Claire, the logistics expert, mapped out the town's vulnerable spots on a large chalkboard in George's garage. Every road, alley, and open space was carefully marked. "We'll funnel them here," Claire said, pointing to a narrow street that led to the center of town. "If we can control this area, we can cut off their escape routes." "And what if they try to go off-road?" Marty asked, leaning against a crate filled with improvised gadgets. "That's where my toys come in," Alex replied with a grin. He held up a device resembling a spike strip, but far more advanced. "This baby disables any vehicle's engine as soon as the wheels touch it." George nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the map. "They'll think they're in control until it's too late." The first priority was the gas station where the conflict began. Marty and Max set up surveillance drones to monitor the area and installed a portable EMP device hidden behind the pumps. If Razor's gang tried to use the station as a base again, they'd be powerless. Alex and Claire focused on the narrow streets leading into town. Using retractable barricades and strategically placed traps, they created a path that would force the bikers into a choke point. "We'll make them feel like they're hurting us," Alex said, tightening a bolt on a barricade, "but we'll be the ones hurting them." George's house was fortified like a fortress. Automated turrets, non-lethal but intimidating, were installed around the perimeter, and the drones were programmed to patrol the area constantly. In his workshop, George worked on a final piece of technology, a long-range signal disruptor that could cut off Razor's communication with his gang. As George and his team worked, the townspeople began to notice. At first, they were skeptical. What could a group of retirees do against Razor's gang? But as they saw the barricades going up and the drones patrolling the skies, hope began to grow. One of the neighbors, a young mechanic named Jamie, approached George. "You really think you can stop them?" George looked up from his work, his gaze steady. "I know." Jamie hesitated, then nodded. "If you need help, I'm in." More neighbors began to offer their assistance, bringing tools, supplies, and even their own vehicles to help reinforce the town. George's quiet determination was contagious, and for the first time in months, the town felt united. Meanwhile, Razor and his gang were gearing up for their own attack. Razor had dismissed the drone's warning as a bluff, but deep down he felt uneasy. No one had ever stood up to him before, and the idea of an old man being the first infuriated him. "We hit his house first," Razor told his gang as they gathered in the warehouse. "We'll burn it down and send a message to anyone else who thinks they can mess with us." Sketch, the youngest member of the gang, shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, what if he's got backup? That drone wasn't normal." Razor glared at him. "Are you scared of some old man? We're the ones in charge here. He's nothing." But Sketch couldn't shake the image of George's calm, unflinching eyes. By late afternoon, Razor's gang rolled into town, their motorcycles roaring like thunder. They headed straight for George's house, confident they'd crush him with one show of force. But as they approached the driveway, the first drone appeared, hovering silently above them. Razor laughed, swatting at it like an annoying fly. "Is this his big defense?" Razor scoffed. "A toy drone?" The drone emitted a high-pitched beep before zooming away. Moments later, Razor's lead bike skidded to a stop as the EMP device, hidden beneath the gravel, activated. One by one, the gang's bikes stalled, their engines sputtering into silence. "What the hell?" Razor growled, kicking his useless motorcycle. Before they could react, a second wave of drones appeared, dropping harmless but blinding smoke bombs around the gang. Disoriented, they stumbled through the smoke, cursing and yelling. George's voice crackled through a hidden speaker. "I warned you. Now you're in my world." The gang scrambled to regroup, but as they moved toward George's property, they triggered another trap. A hidden barricade sprang up, blocking their path. Razor slammed his fist against it, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't over!" he shouted into the air. From a safe vantage point, George and his team watched the chaos unfold on their surveillance monitors. "They're already panicking," Max said, adjusting the camera feed. "This is almost too easy." "Don't get cocky," Claire warned. "Desperation makes people dangerous." George remained focused, his hand steady as he worked on fine-tuning the signal disruptor. "Let them get desperate," he said. "They'll make mistakes, and we'll be ready." Razor's gang, battered and humiliated, retreated to regroup. They hadn't expected resistance, let alone an organized defense. Razor paced back and forth, his anger barely contained. "That old man's gonna pay for this," Razor growled. "We hit the whole town tomorrow. Burn it down if we have to." Sketch, standing at the edge of the group, hesitated before speaking. "Boss, maybe we should back off. This guy, he's not normal." Razor rounded on him, grabbing him by the collar. "You want to back off? Fine, but you're out of the gang." Sketch swallowed hard and said nothing. Razor shoved him away, turning back to the others. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we finish this." As Razor prepares for an all-out assault on the town, George and his team fortify their final defenses. The townspeople step up to help, and the battle reaches its peak, pushing both sides to their limits. The early morning sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of the town, but the stillness was deceptive. Beneath the surface, tension simmered, ready to erupt. George Kendrick stood on the front porch of his home, surveying the preparations his team had made. Every street, alley, and vulnerable spot in town had been fortified. His team had worked through the night, and now the town was as ready as it could be. George sipped his coffee, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Razor's gang wouldn't be far behind. "Everything's in place," Claire said, stepping up beside him. She held a tablet showing the drone feeds, which displayed the barricades and traps they'd set up around town. "The locals are ready too. We've stationed them at the safe zones." George nodded. "Good, but this isn't over until Razor and his gang are out of the picture for good." By mid-morning, the sound of roaring engines shattered the quiet. Razor's gang rolled into town, their numbers larger than expected. It wasn't just Razor's core group. He'd called in reinforcements from neighboring gangs. Dozens of motorcycles tore down the streets, the riders shouting and revving their engines. Razor led the charge, his face twisted in determination. "This is our town now!" he bellowed, his voice carrying over the noise. The gang split into groups, each heading toward different parts of the town. But what they didn't know was that every move they made was being tracked by George's surveillance drones. As Razor's group approached the barricades on Main Street, Alex's trap was triggered. Hidden retractable spikes shot up from the ground, shredding the tires of the lead bikes. Razor skidded to a halt, narrowly avoiding a crash. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, kicking his stalled bike. Suddenly, drones appeared overhead, buzzing like an angry swarm of bees. The drones dropped small, harmless smoke bombs, filling the street with thick clouds. Razor's gang stumbled through the smoke, coughing and disoriented. From a hidden loudspeaker, George's calm voice echoed. "You should have stayed away." One of Razor's lieutenants, a hulking man named Tank, shouted, "Where is he? Show yourself, old man!" The gang blindly pushed forward, only to find their path blocked by barricades. They tried to force their way through, but Alex's automated defenses, nets, stun traps, and more kept them at bay. Meanwhile, another group of bikers tried to take control of the gas station. Marty was waiting for them, hidden inside the building with a remote detonator in his hand. As the bikers pulled in, Marty activated one of his traps. A sudden burst of high-pressure water sprayed from hidden nozzles, knocking several bikers off their feet. The remaining bikes stalled as the EMP device hidden in the gas pumps activated, disabling their engines. Marty stepped out of the shadows, grinning. "You boys picked the wrong town." One of the bikers lunged at him, but Marty was ready. He tossed a smoke grenade, disappearing into the haze. By the time the smoke cleared, the bikers found themselves surrounded by locals armed with makeshift weapons. The tables had turned. Back at his house, George monitored the situation through the drone feeds. His team's defenses were working, but Razor's reinforcements were more aggressive than expected. George knew they needed to end this quickly before anyone got hurt. "Max, is the signal disruptor ready?" George asked, his voice calm but urgent. Max nodded, holding up the small device. "It's ready. Once we activate it, they won't be able to communicate or use their tech." "Good," George said. Let's make sure Razor gets the message." Razor and his remaining gang regrouped in the town square, frustrated and furious. Their bikes were stalled, their weapons were ineffective, and their numbers were dwindling. Razor's confidence was starting to crack. "Come on, old man!" Razor shouted, his voice echoing off the buildings. "Face me!" George stepped into the square, flanked by Max and Alex. He was unarmed, his hands at his sides, but his presence was commanding. "You had your chance to leave," George said, his voice steady. "Now you're out of options." Razor sneered, pulling a crowbar from his bike. "You think I'm scared of you? You're just an old man." George pressed a button on the remote in his hand. The signal disruptor activated, and Razor's gang's remaining electronics, radios, weapons, even their backup vehicles, powered down instantly. "You underestimated me," George said, stepping closer. "Big mistake." Razor charged at George, swinging the crowbar wildly. But George sidestepped with surprising agility, years of discipline and training guiding his movements. Razor stumbled, and before he could recover, Alex and Max stepped in, disarming him and pinning him to the ground. The townspeople began to emerge, surrounding the gang. Armed with courage and determination, they made it clear that Razor's reign of terror was over. By the afternoon, the town was quiet again. Razor and his gang were tied up and waiting for the authorities who had been alerted by George's team. The locals cheered as the police hauled the bikers away, their relief palpable. "You did it," Claire said, standing beside George as they watched the scene unfold. "We all did it," George replied, his voice humble but firm. "This town stood together. That's what made the difference." As the sun set, George's team began dismantling the defenses. The drones were powered down, the traps disarmed, and the barricades removed. George locked away the signal disruptor and other advanced devices in his workshop, sealing the door behind him. "You're really putting it all away?" Max asked. "For now," George said with a faint smile. "But if they ever come back, we'll be ready." That night, as George sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, a small drone hovered into view. It dropped a note into his lap, carrying a simple message. "You've made enemies. We'll be watching." George stared at the note for a moment before crumpling it in his hand. He stood, his gaze steady as he looked out into the night. "Let them watch," he muttered. "I'm not going anywhere." The morning sun rose over a quiet town that had been through a storm. The streets were eerily calm, but George Kendrick, the 93-year-old retired engineer, knew better than to believe the peace was permanent. Razor's gang had been dismantled, their bikes confiscated, and their leader hauled off to jail. The townsfolk were rebuilding, but for George, there was a gnawing feeling deep inside. This wasn't over. As George tightened the bolts on his truck's repaired tire, the crunch of gravel behind him made him pause. He turned to see a black SUV pulling into his driveway. The sleek vehicle gleamed in the morning sun, and its tinted windows gave away nothing about its passenger. George straightened, his hands steady, but his mind sharp. When the driver's door opened, a tall man in a dark suit stepped out. His gait was measured, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Kendrick," the man said, his tone calm and precise. "My name is Special Agent Price. I work with Homeland Security." George wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What does Homeland Security want with a retired engineer?" Price offered a faint smile but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim folder. "Your little operation against Razor's gang caused quite a stir. It turns out their group was tied to a much larger criminal network, one that doesn't take kindly to interference." George remained silent, his sharp gaze fixed on Price. The agent continued. "You didn't just stop a local gang. You disrupted a major smuggling operation. And now their associates are asking questions about you." "Let them ask," George said evenly. "I'm not going anywhere." Price's smile faded. "That's exactly the problem. They're not just going to ask, they're going to retaliate. And when they do, it won't be a few bikers on motorcycles. It'll be something far worse." George folded his arms. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Price said, stepping closer, "if they come after you, They'll come after this town. You've put yourself in the crosshairs of some very dangerous people." George's expression hardened. "I've faced dangerous people before." Price nodded, slipping the folder back into his jacket. "I hope you're ready, Mr. Kendrick, because they're coming, sooner than you think." That night, George called his remaining allies. Max, Claire, Alex, and Marty returned, knowing this would be their last stand together. The town wasn't just facing another gang, it was up against an organized syndicate with resources, weapons, and intelligence. "We can't let them destroy this place," George said as his team gathered in his workshop. "We've spent our lives building and protecting things. Let's make sure this town stays standing." Together, they fortified the key areas of the town, turning it into a defensive stronghold. Advanced drones patrolled the skies, hidden traps lined the streets, and an upgraded EMP device was placed in the center of town, ready to disable any electronic equipment the syndicate brought with them. The townsfolk, inspired by George's leadership, joined the effort. Jamie, the young mechanic, led a group of volunteers to assist with the preparations. The entire community came together, determined to defend their home. At dawn, the convoy arrived. Blacked-out SUVs and armored trucks rolled into town, their engines humming with menace. The syndicate's men disembarked, armed to the teeth and moving with military precision. But they didn't know what they were walking into. As they advanced down Main Street, the first wave of drones descended, dropping blinding smoke bombs and releasing high-pitched sonic disruptors that sent the attackers reeling. Hidden barricades funneled them into tight choke points, where George's traps awaited. Spiked strips disabled their vehicles, and automated turrets forced them to retreat. The syndicate's leader, a cold and calculating man named Victor Kane, stood at the edge of the chaos, barking orders. "Find him! Bring me Kendrick!" As Victor's men regrouped, George stepped into the square, flanked by Max, Claire, and Alex. His voice rang out, calm but commanding. "You're not welcome here." Victor turned, his icy gaze locking onto George. "You're the old man causing all this trouble?" George's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Trouble? I call it cleaning up," Victor sneered. "You're out of your league, old man. Step down, and I might let you walk away." George pressed a button on the remote in his hand, activating the EMP device. Instantly, Victor's men's equipment, radios, weapons, even the vehicles, powered down, leaving them exposed. "You underestimated me," George said, his voice steady. "Big mistake." Victor lunged forward, but George was ready. Using a gadget he'd hidden in his jacket, he released a shockwave that sent Victor sprawling. Max and Alex moved in, disarming the remaining attackers with precision and skill. By midday, the syndicate was defeated. The authorities arrived, led by Special Agent Price, to round up the remaining attackers. Victor Kane was taken into custody, his icy demeanor replaced with silent rage. Price approached George, a hint of respect in his eyes. "You're quite the problem solver, Mr. Kendrick." George shrugged. "Just doing what needed to be done." As the townsfolk gathered to celebrate, George's team began packing up. They knew this was the last time they'd fight together. "You sure you don't want to come with us, George?" Claire asked. "This is my home," George replied, looking out at the town, "and it always will be." That evening, George sat on his porch, the town quiet once again. His tools and gadgets were locked away, and the workshop lights were off. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax. A small drone hovered into view, dropping a note into his lap. It read, "You've earned your peace, for now." George chuckled softly, crumpling the note in his hand. He sipped his coffee, gazing out at the horizon. "Let them come," he thought. "I'll be ready." As the sun dipped below the horizon, George leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile on his face. The town was safe, and for now, that was enough. And that's how a 93-year-old retired engineer stood up to a gang of bikers and even a powerful criminal syndicate, using nothing but his genius, determination, and a lifetime of experience. But what would you do if faced with a similar challenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The narrator's voice becomes more engaging. If this story inspired you, hit that like button to show your support for fearless ingenuity and resilience. And if you want to hear more incredible stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest uploads. The camera zooms out from George as the narrator concludes. Remember, sometimes it's not about strength, it's about strategy. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. The screen transitions to an end card with suggested videos and a prominent subscribe button.